live on GBC Ghana Online and on Facebook at Ghana Broadcasting Corporation. Recent coups and attempted coups in the sub-region have led to some disquiet about security in West Africa. After the January 24th coup in Burkina Faso and the failed attempt in Guinea-Bissau a few days later, ECOWAS once again convened an extraordinary summit in Accra, where the President of Ghana and the ECOWAS chairperson stated the following. The summit will focus on emerging threats in our region that stem from the military's interference in Mali and its contagious influence in Guinea and Burkina Faso. He urged the heads of state to help, quote, find a sustainable solution to the resurgence of the cancer in our region. Let us address, he said, this dangerous trend collectively and decisively before it devastates the whole region. On Talking Point tonight, we engage two experts on security in the sub-region. We encourage you to join the discussion during our show using our WhatsApp number 055-744-6429. With me for tonight's discussion on my immediate left is Dr. Prosper Adi. He's a security and defense analyst. Welcome, Dr. Adi. Ado. Sorry. Next to him is Dr. Chukwuemeka Ize. He's the executive director of the West African National Network for Peace Building. Welcome. Okay, so we've had a series of coups, successful ones and failed ones. Burkina Faso, Mali, Chad, and then the failed ones are Niger and Guinea-Bissau, and of course Sudan and then Mali. So I want to start with you, Dr. Ado. How concerned are you when, especially in the last few months, we've had these spate of coups, and then we had Burkina Faso, and then a few days later we had the attempted coup in Guinea-Bissau.
Good evening, and thank you for having me on the program. I also extend regards to your cherished viewers and listeners. Let me start by saying that it is very worrying having these recent developments, because there used to be a time when coups were very intensive, and then we got to that phase where we thought it was becoming a thing of the past. And I have always held that coups cannot be wished away. You cannot wish it away, because if the conditions are ripe, they would come back. And so it's really unfortunate that this is what we are seeing currently. And you know, before we go a bit further into the discussion, I want to hasten to quickly mention that coups or unconstitutional changes must begin to be viewed in such a way that if responses are supposed to be punchy, then the definition given to it, you know, must be put in context. You'll notice that normally we talk about the military making coups. So they take up arms, they overthrow a constitutionally elected government, and they take over for an interim period. And it's supposed to be restoring the country back to constitutional rule under pressure and all that. But also, if you look at the, I know we'll come to all these, but just to lay the basis, if you look at the supplementary protocol for ECOWAS, you know, supplementary to the ECOWAS conflict prevention mechanism, it talks about obtaining power and maintaining power. What that means is that if you're in government and your time is up and you want to maintain power, and you do everything to stay in power, having exceeded your term limit, it must be considered as an unconstitutional change. It must not just be the military that takes a gun that makes it a coup. So we must go beyond this mentality of just military coups. We also begin to embrace this concept of civilians making coups, and that's to say perhaps sitting heads of states, you know, and looking at it from that way makes it easy for us to respond. You know.
Because Dr. Ize, the president had said, ECOWAS chairperson had said that it must be contained before it devastates the whole region. I wanted, before I asked how can this become accomplished, I actually wanted to situate it within what he just said, because Professor Emerita Techiwa Menu was recently interviewed by a local station, and this is precisely what she said. When somebody changes the rules and runs for a third term, we didn't hear ECOWAS condemning that. Why did ECOWAS not condemn that? Why did the African Union not condemn that? Right now, everybody is laughing when ECOWAS imposes sanctions, and it's like, there you go again. But where were they when this was happening? And what it does is that it eats into the credibility of ECOWAS and the African Union. How do you respond to something like this? What are your thoughts?
I think we must appreciate ECOWAS within the context of its limitations. ECOWAS operates with its protocols and its normative frameworks. Once something is not contained in ECOWAS protocol, they do not have the will for enforcement. Secondly, there's a thin line between the principle of non-interference and the principle of non-indifference. It's a thin line. Where do you define non-interference, and where do you define the principle of non-indifference? Now, the ECOWAS protocol that Prosper referred to, the ECOWAS protocol on democracy and good governance, 2001, was very clear about unconstitutional change of government or even maintaining government. However, if a national government within the confines of its constitution, through its National Assembly, make a new law that extends the tenure of office of a sitting president, ECOWAS hands are tied to the extent that the representative of the people, in quote, have made those amendments. There's nothing ECOWAS can do. And that is why, when we had the second coup d'etat last year, which is Guinea-Bissau, and listening to the authority of heads of state and government invite ECOWAS Commission and other stakeholders to take necessary steps to review the protocol on democracy and good governance, we felt it was a very good opportunity. And we, as civil society, rallied round the commission and made our proposals. Unfortunately, like it happened in 2014, unfortunately, we could not get that pass through the authority. First, in 2014, it was killed by two countries. Then the Gambia and Togo. Bring forward again in 2021. We pushed again to see whether we can leverage on the commitment made by the authority in its own summit. Again, it did not see the light of the day. So that makes the commission, or ECOWAS in general, helpless when civilians are keeping or maintaining power through its...
Okay, so if research shows that the extension of power is a critical part of the destabilization, how then can ECOWAS uphold the sanctity of the protocols that are supportive of the democratic process in a climate such as this, Dr. Adu?
I think that it has come to the point where enforcement needs to be taken very seriously. But as my colleague mentioned, enforcement again lies within the powers of the authority, that is the heads of state and government of ECOWAS. You see, this is the interesting thing. Anything that must be approved are approved by the leaders. They sign and they commit to obey it. But unfortunately, you will notice that there are instances where some don't. And if that happens, intervention becomes interesting. And let me explain a bit. It is clearly stated in the ECOWAS conflict prevention mechanism, that of the 1999, with a very long title. It talks about human rights violation, violent abuses of human rights, lack of respect for the rule of law. And it also talks about, there's a third one, not respecting democratic principles. It states clearly that if these are not done, ECOWAS can intervene and make sure that the right thing happens. Okay. So it has a leeway for enforcement. So let's take it that, okay, ECOWAS wants to intervene. Does it have the capacity, the wherewithal?
The will.
And also the will to go in there to enforce anything. We saw in specific some countries, not big ones, where there were coup d'etats and they were quickly forced to reverse it. My memory serves me right, maybe Sao Tome and Principe at a point in time when General Obasanjo was quite robust. And of course there was another one. I don't know if it's the Niger case or one of them. So they were able to stamp. And that time you had vibrant and dynamic leaders who were committed to ensuring that this works. Now, if we say we have an ECOWAS standby force, and we want to intervene in a country where maybe a sitting leader extends the term limit, is it going to be an all-out war? Would the head of state step down and allow, the constitution to take its course? These are critical questions. But more to that, I now go back to Dr. Eze's statement. You see, if the protocols don't give you that power, then it is difficult to do it. But we have leeway here in which is being clearly defined when we have to intervene. So if you use the track of diplomacy, 1, 2, and even 3, which is the formal, informal, and a mixture, with all the envoys and the high representatives and all that, you're talking, you're doing mediation, it's not working. And now you bring in the sanctions and it's also still not working. There must be some amount of enforcement if it is possible. But prior to all these is the fact that prevention is key.
Okay. So talking about prevention, Dr. Eze, the ECOWAS conflict prevention framework was adopted in 2008 and systematic response to new regional environments. So the aim of it was to strengthen the human security architecture of West Africa and also find a way for interaction and collaboration in the sub-region so people are aware of what is happening in each other's countries with the aim of, preventing conflict, well, maybe not preventing, but mitigating the effects of conflict. How do you think it's going so far? How do you think this framework is really working, and how are the countries sharing information, human security architecture that was formulated by this convention, this,
The CPF was supposed to demonstrate the political will of our leaders to indeed invest in conflict prevention. That's why the 14 pillars of the ECPF was very clear and diverse with regards to its focus on human security. And a lot of what we think could have happened to avert the situation we find ourselves today should have been dealt with within the confines of the ECPF, which includes, we have observed through the early warning system, which is one of the key cardinal pillars of the ECOWAS conflict prevention framework. We have observed that there is a nexus between two. Number one, countries with consolidated autocracy and countries with ambiguity as it relates to term limits and instability or coup d'etat. That has been established. A movement from consolidated autocracy to consolidated democracy is always chaotic. It's always very chaotic. So, once we observe that, it was done on us that the only way to continue in the trajectory of conflict prevention is to impute or include in the ECOWAS Protocol on Democracy and Good Governance the fact that the same way you cannot amend your electoral law 6 months before the election, you cannot do more than 2 terms. But you know the way ECOWAS is structured is not that if you have 13 against 2, you win the day. ECOWAS is built on consensus, not on democracy. So if it is even the smallest country, they will have to convince that smallest country to be able to push through. And Ghana was chair then, did everything to push through that review. It was killed at the level of the Council of Ministers. They pushed it through to the authority, only for Togo and Gambia to go against it. So, within that context, what do you do? The ECOWAS conflict prevention framework is as viable as the will of the leaders make it to be. Look at the enabling pillar, which is the peace fund. I can assure you that the peace fund is the ECOWAS peace fund with other people's money. So where is the will to really invest, apart from the little percentage that comes from community level? The peace fund is empty with European resources. So how can we continue to talk about African solutions to African problems with another person's money? That's not feasible.
Okay, let's bring the conversation to Ghana for a minute, Dr. Adu. I wanted to read a series of just a few things. OneUp actually did an article on 2020 about the current peace and security dynamics in perspective, and they talked about some of the existing threats being chieftaincy and ethnic clashes, farmer-herder conflicts, violent demonstrations, proliferation of arms, and they go on and on. Then in 2021, the National Peace Council had a training session, and the headline was Peace Council Reviews Major Threats to Ghana's Peace. And in there, they identify violent demonstrations, again, like you had, farmer-herder conflicts and violent communication through the media, some of the biggest threats. And they go on saying that if these are not checked, they could undermine the development and growth of the sub-region. Yeah. And then fast forward to February 5th, Friday, where Amboseri made a statement that was read on his behalf. Again, he talked about the internal indicators included the simmering communal conflicts related to land and natural resources, succession disputes among chiefs, particularly in the northern part of the country. So we see a thread running through all of these, something that has, and I'm sure there are studies that happened before OneUp study that I read. So when you look at all these things and you're connecting the dots between the threats that we have in terms of security threats, what are we as a country doing? Looking at these things and seeing how we can mitigate the effect. Because one of the things Amboseri also said, Honorable Amboseri also said, was that graduate youth unemployment, which we've talked about so many times. And again, the herder farmer conflicts youth. So what are your thoughts?
Okay. So there are so many issues here which is contributing to insecurity. Now, the bottom line, as we just previously discussed, is that ECOWAS moving from ECOWAS Affairs of State to ECOWAS of the People is to ensure that within the human security context, everyone lives in such a way that the person is happy, okay. People must have their needs met, whether within the political, economic, social, security, or whichever area. And so where people are disaffected and they are not happy, like you mentioned the youth factor, it becomes like a cannon fodder for major trouble. You mentioned the farmer-herder dispute, which is across West Africa. And the issue is not to be addressed only physically by operations. It has bigger cultural dynamics that must be looked into. And so I give one quick example. In an interview with one of the big chiefs in Ogun State, you know, the Moigesho, I think of Ijebu Itele or something, he had his own way of addressing farmer-herder something. In fact, he got the people to pay for the crops that were grazed upon, to the extent that when the people, the herders paid the settler farmers, they then asked that since we have paid, allow the animals to graze the rest, and then you can go ahead and do whatever you want because we have paid for it. And it was nicely resolved. This is wisdom, traditional wisdom. It can be tapped into. Just giving an example. But so, in responding to this question directly, I think that there are so many issues coming up which should not be politicized. It must go beyond the NDC, NPP dynamics to issues of national interest, collective interest. And how do we build a country for the youth and our children who are coming up? The Boko conflict is there. People are using arms, huge. You mentioned the whole issue of unemployment. Youth are frustrated. To the extent you have market women calling for coups, that's worrying. And you see, when there's a handwriting on the wall, we don't respond to it. We wait until things degenerate before we are suddenly seen as doing something. And so, for me, I think that in all these dynamics, there are certain basic things we should do. One, let people continue to talk. Let people criticize. Let there be free speech. Let people disagree. It must not be fist cuffs, but let people continue to do democracy. It's very important. Number two, government must not be seen to be intransigent when people are talking. Sometimes there's a tendency to assume that I'm in government and so I have the power to do everything. My people have empowered me. But there are other sections who may also differ in many ways. Government must take this into consideration and ensure that in addressing some of these things, those concerns are addressed. Because these are the basic things which foment trouble and leads to bigger problems. So finally, maybe before my colleague also comes in, I must also talk about all these issues of corruption. We have huge amounts of resources going to waste, which can go to address basic problems. But we are unable to retrieve these monies. Where are they? Can it be seen to be used and put to good use? To the extent that if that happens, people are then willing to cooperate on other policies and all that. You see, so these things are issues which should go beyond the NDC and NPP. And we must adopt the collective interest approach to move the country forward.
Did you want to add to what he said? Or?
Yeah, I think I agree fully with my brother Prosper. You see, one of the things that I've noticed, not just in Ghana, but in many countries in Africa, is that while we continue to talk about human security, our security architecture is still so state-centric and so hardcore-centric, rather than investing in citizens' welfare. And that's a problem. You know, so if you look at the posture of many of the security architecture in Africa today, Ghana inclusive, is still with the mentality of how do you arm the state through the military or through the police, you know, reform police, do this. If you look at even the people that, a lot of countries, there are people that occupy the office of the National Security Advisor and all that. They are either people with security background, core security background, and so on and so forth. We are still not focusing on that same concept of human security that without. That's on one part. The second thing is that, luckily for Ghana, the resilient factors are huge, but that should not be taken for granted. What are those resilient factors? Most of the fault lines that break countries in Africa, Ghana is lucky to have had a way around that, whether it is ethnicity or religion. Because of your educational system, movement from the north to the south, because of party formation not along ethnic or religious line, all these are resilient factors. Okay? Now, what should not be taken for granted is how to continue to strengthen those resilient factors and also begin to build new factors that could sustain the country. Because the environment, when the environment continues to be ripe, whether induced by neighboring countries or induced by internal factors that are obvious, including that which have been mentioned by the Honorable Minister, which include youth unemployment, you know, arms availability, and so on and so forth, then it means that the pushing factors, the push factors to violence is going to overwhelm those resilient factors. And that would be a very big problem.
So if we talk about security governance then, what kinds of reforms, security sector reforms, the conversations we should be having, what kinds of conversations should we be having on emerging security reforms that would augment or actually help us meet what you're trying to talk about? Because one of the questions I asked earlier was, how do we share information amongst the ECOWAS countries? Do we have a protocol for that? And is that functioning as it ought to function? And if what we are doing is, like you said, the older way, which is equipping and arming each other's borders, then we are going to find ourselves lacking when the real threats come to meet us. So what kinds of conversations should we be having about some of these more robust or emerging trends and security reform?
I think the first thing we have to appreciate is that the 21st century security cannot focus on just how to equip the military and the police. That's number one. Number two is that we cannot claim to be in a community and address every security threat as a national issue. There must be conversation amongst the security architectures within the sub-region. Number three is that we must review our investments. While we have invested in this reactive method, how much have we invested in conflict prevention? Look at the budget of National Peace Council, for example. Compare that with the budget of other security outfits, and you see it's peanuts. National Peace Council barely survive on overheads. Every other thing is paid for by somebody. You know, how do we resource an institution like National Peace Council and ensure that it has systems that enables it to monitor, analyze, intervene, do a lot of all the work that it wants to do? Look at their work plan, for example. How do they make sure that every year when they have an annual work plan, they are able to implement that? Our country cannot copy and paste conflict prevention. It must be indigenous to us. Investment in education, investment in peace education, these are all forms of, conflict prevention for us. Long term, the results don't come today. But we want the ones that the result will be quick, immediate, and that we can report and have political mileage.
So let's go back a bit to the situation about the coup d'etat and everything. And the executive director of the Abuja-based Center for Democracy and Development said the coups in Mali and Guinea were driven by widespread public disaffection with democratically elected leaders who, as we stated earlier in his words, overstayed their welcome. The failure of democracy to deliver development to the people, which goes back again to what we were saying earlier, has pushed Africans to welcome coup d'etats. And then there's also someone who is the ex-head of the Open Society Initiative for West Africa. And she said that coups reflected a creeping sense that elections, and by association, democracy, are not delivering on the promise, nor do they reflect the will of the people. So when you find countries where, like you were saying earlier, try and dialogue, talk, listen, shouldn't more leaders be concerned that this, maybe the word I'm looking for is not what is coming to mind, but this when we hold these positions we refuse to give, may be something that festers and actually develops into something that becomes more than we ever imagined we could. And what should leaders be looking out for when they are leading people and maybe not everybody is on board?
I think that going forward, we've gotten to that critical juncture where when somebody, let's say a sitting leader, decides to change the constitution because he thinks he has the right to, and the people are not happy, they must give the caution that this is going down a steep slope. And peers, colleague heads of states, must quickly make pronouncements and get there to address all these issues of going beyond term limits. what even makes it more difficult is that you also have sitting heads of states who have done that and have succeeded. And so sometimes in asking them to accompany delegations to go and seek redress in other member states, it becomes a challenge. And so it's a whole complex kind of issue. But we must allow the principles. There's enough in the supplementary protocol on democracy and good governance 2001. Enough. The ECOWAS conflict prevention framework just built on it. It is shifting sovereignty to supranationality, that people would be able to go in there and make pronouncements. It is shifting regime security to human security, that the needs of the people must be addressed. So if there is anything going ultra-virus, they should be able to be naming and shaming, making statements, engaging heavily, and making sure that the right thing is done. So you talked about term limits, you talked about elections. I think we've gotten to a stage where when we deploy observer missions, and it is not free, fair, and transparent, delegations, observer missions must state that. I know sometimes it's an issue of cost. Are we going to do the elections again? Huge cost involved in all that. But democracy is expensive. If people feel aggrieved because they've been disenfranchised, and you don't include them in the governance system, and we all sit down and just look unconcerned, it's going to cause trouble. Something must be said. Something must be done to address. So it's all the issue of enforcement. We have everything written in the protocols. Who gets it enforced? Leadership. And there's another dimension to it. When the coups happen, the military leaders look for approval of civilians to stay in government. Like you saw, we are seeing in Sudan currently, it's not the case, because the people are not happy. They were in that period of transition, and it is time for the military to hand over to the civilian, to complete the transitional period, make provision for elections, and let it go. The military has refused in blatant. Oh, to now budge. What happens? So people are always in the street for about 3 months and over now. They are there protesting. And so, in such cases, I think that even the civilians in these countries must begin to talk. They should not be seen to be approving coups, no matter how difficult the situation is. But they must also ensure that together with the other powers that be, they make it clear that it is because of them that the sitting leader is there. And if the right thing is not being done, they have every power to ensure that that is addressed.
I know we are talking about the the sub-region, but I think it's also good to say that democracy is a very fragile thing. Look what happened in the United States. It shows you that, you know, if you don't protect it, if you don't nurture it, if you don't really jealously make sure that the systems are in place, anything could happen in the twinkle of an eye, even with the best of intentions.
Absolutely.
And sometimes it takes individuals that make a difference. I wanted to go back to you, Dr. Eze. You were speaking earlier about some of the situations, the 14 situations in the ECPA. But what about the countries with family dynasties? The Nyasingbe is, you know, you go to Gabon, you have the Bongos, you have Congo, and then, you know, yeah. What about those? Is that something that the ECOWAS needs to be worried about? Is that something that they have had conversations about, or is that something that they remain quiet on?
I think it's more about how those people get into power than about the dynasty. Because in America, you had the Bush dynasty.
Yeah, but it wasn't like all until,
yeah, and
know.
people were not worried about that. The problem is that in our own climb, there are two things we must be very wary about. Number one is that democracy is not delivering the dividends to the expectation of the people. And if in 21st century a coup d'etat takes place and citizens jump to the streets to welcome the military, then our civilian leaders should be worried. because the citizens are passing messages, and they are passing that loud and clear. The second thing is that ECOWAS can no longer continue to fold its hands on the basis of non-interference. I think that it has come to a point where if for any reason you take steps that ECOWAS feel could lead your country into a certain, there must be clear punitive measures, which include that if we intervene, like we want to intervene, your country must find a way to pay for it. I think some of the things that is beginning to happen to ECOWAS is that there are few countries that resource ECOWAS. And therefore, once there's any problem, ECOWAS begins to step back because it's not finding the resources to do that. And then again, based on some of these unique indicators we have started observing, which includes this sit-tight. In West Africa, you can even argue that it's fair. In Central Africa, I can't think of any leader that is less than 25 years in office. And we have all observed that this is only but a time bomb. So why can't we collectively address that, and make that a thing of the past? It is more worrisome that a regional economic community like ECOWAS that have become reference on the continent is now enmeshed in this nonsense. So that tells you about the quality of the leaders we had in the past and the leadership deficit that we continue to suffer in our region and continent today.
I mean, I think a good question would be, how do we bridge that gap in terms of the leadership gap, where in the past one would think that people listened to the people, were the voice of the people, and now in some countries it would seem like, and again I referenced the US, we saw that there, where it was seen like, because I want this, I want to stay here, so therefore what I want is the will of the people, so to speak. That deficit in leadership, how do we bridge that so that we are moving forward in tandem with the people rather than there's this divide between us and them?
Two things. Prosper already made reference to one. Our leadership recruitment process must be clear and unambiguous. You can't buy your way into power. The second thing is that I think the docility of the citizens is also contributing to that. In the past, you may not be able to count the number of civil society voices, for example, that you can hear. When things like this happen, people take to the streets, are vocal about there are very few of such independent professional civil society organizations. What's happened is that during the military era in West Africa, we all were vocal because everybody was human rights activists trying to chase away the military. The moment the military, as it were chased back to the barracks, we felt everything was okay. Yeah. And we also went to sleep. So I can count voices. Look at the way you're reading, you can count vocal civil society actors today that can boldly challenge the state. And that's also making the state and the government so relaxed.
Yeah. So, I mean, I mentioned some countries, but you also have a country like Cameroon and Paul Biya. When we look at security threats and potentials, is that a country that's managing things well, or is that a country that could potentially, they have the language issue also, a country that we have to worry about?
I would add that a country, first and foremost, gets the leader it elects. So whomever you put in power, without making the right decisions, if you begin to face problems, you blame yourself. Yeah. And next time, when you go to the polls, then you make sure you make the right decision. But you see, that's also preconditioned on will the elections be free and fair. So the issues are interlocked. And then, when you have a sitting leader who stays for so long, he has done all he can offer. Can somebody else come? If he's not going, Is ECOWAS going to move the standby force and go and eject? Is that a possibility? Are the people going to be in the streets consistently and ask the leader to go? Doing demonstrations in a well-organized manner without human rights abuses. Consistent, sending a voice out there. The other issue is this. Is it only that one person who has all the knowledge and the ability to rule? Must it always be an individual who is 70 years and over? Can a young man take the powers?
Or a woman.
Or a woman.
Thank you.
And get it done. And you know, I'm a gender activist as well, so I fully support that.
Yes.
You see, so I think that if we do the same thing and we want a change, then we're just deceiving ourselves. We must begin to do things outside the laid down norms, which have been overtaken by developments. We must begin to make sure that things change. And without the change, it's difficult. And so, as we talk right now, in Chad, for instance, you have the son of the president who was killed when he went to the war front, taken over. And it has remained so. And so when such precedents are set and nothing is done, there's the impression out there that but we can also do it. Others have done it. Okay, so some attempt it, and if it happens, then it follows a particular pattern. There's supposed to be a transition. Now, if that transition, and normally it used to be that when military handover, they allow civilians to preside over that transition and hand over to an elected, a democratically elected government. Now the civilian stays in power, sorry, the military stays there, finds a way of elongating or prolonging that term, so he can then civilianize himself from the military context and then stand and find a way of continuing. So what was the purpose for taking over? To bring himself into the equation and reverse. And then there's another side aspect of the whole dynamics. You see an opposition leader, very vocal, speaking, criticizing, is elected, then he gets into the trappings of power and begins to repeat the same thing like it happened in Guinea. And I'll tell you an interesting story. You know, I served in Liberia for a long time, and while there, there was an election and all that, and there were problems. So we had one of the leaders who was overthrown come to visit. I was sitting right there with the president and the aspiring, so to speak, president in the waiting and all that. And this person who was overthrown was talking to the two leaders. He was saying, look, do the right thing. You must go this way. We have the protocols. This is what they say. Two presidents were there. One sitting currently, the other one has been overthrown. Now, after that, there was calm, there was peace, and things went well. There was handover of power to the current Liberian president. Down the line, the problems which the president who was overthrown came to resolve started happening in his country, and he will not budge. He will not give chance. He continued. He prolonged his stay, changed the constitution, extended the term limit, and he was overthrown. So what happened in his opposition days when he was vocal and calling for the right things to do? And then you come into power, you follow the same trend, and you make it worse. And so, you see, if we are not true to ourselves, these are the things. It's gotten to that time when we as a people must begin to reflect and do the right things. And we cannot go the cheap way and expect good results. We must pay the price, and we must do it right. Without doing that, it becomes difficult.
Okay, so just a few questions or statements that we have. One says, the question of leadership in Africa is currently under scrutiny. It is displaying a culture of impunity. And the next one is, maybe I'll go to you, Dr. Eze. What are the avenues in place within ECOWAS to remove repressive leaders, even if the atrocities are well documented?
You see, I think there is a very fundamental error that ECOWAS is making. This idea of when a coup d'etat takes place, the template is release the president unconditionally and give us a roadmap for your transition. I think that should change. I think ECOWAS should insist that power be returned to that president. I think that's what ECOWAS, if ECOWAS continue in this trajectory of allowing the civilians to sometimes even determine the roadmap for transition, it becomes very attractive. But if you insist, return power to that president that you have overthrown, and then we can begin to negotiate maybe a new election or something, it will have a different face altogether. This template is no longer working. That's number one. Number two is that I'll still go back to the protocol. The protocol is limiting with regards to its ability to bite. So the idea is, let's review the protocol and bring in some of these aspects, including that which the viewer have asked, which is, if a leader becomes repressive or refuses to leave power, what should ECOWAS do? Once it is signed, that ECOWAS should sign it by force, you can be sure that ECOWAS remains the fastest responders on issues within this protocol. He did it in Gambia successfully. He did it in Burkina when it was needed. But where it is limiting, that's where you see them running around with different summits.
Extraordinary summit.
Yeah.
But what about Mali, where there was a time frame and the time frame wasn't adhered to? What kind of punitive measures is ECOWAS capable of giving in situations like that?
It is stated there clearly in the supplementary protocol. And so it goes back to denouncing that government and asking it to hand over power immediately to a civilian kind of. It will not hold meetings in that country. The country remains suspended until the situation is reversed. And if it fails to do all that, then you slap all the sanctions against the economic, the political, freezing of assets and all that. Unfortunately, these leaders whom they slap all these things on are in power, and they find their way to feel comfortable, and it is the people who bear the brunt. You see, so for me, I would even say, from what my brother has said, that if the leader is being intransigent and he's even overthrown, and you don't return him to power, ask these military guys to immediately hand over power to a transitional government presided over by a civilian, or who says there's not a speaker who can preside over that interim period. I mean, there are structures, there are arms of government, all laid out there. It's just like in the military.
It's become reward for bad behavior.
Exactly. You have command, and that's why the military does not break down. If A is not there, B can step in. And you see, let me also quickly add something before I forget. The military, it's written there in the supplementary protocol that when training is being done, military, police, all those in the security agencies, they must be educated on the issues of human rights, international humanitarian law, democratic principles, and all these things. They must learn it, both at the regional level, sub-regional level, and even internally, so they get used to these things. The other side of it is this. When you, as a military, take over power, you must remember that you are not trained to rule. You have a command structure and you have a control structure. The control is for the civilian. Yours is the command. And so if you combine these two, you undermine the principles of democracy.
Country in politics. People are more loyal to people and party than they are to the state. Let me ask you about something that I found very innocuous, but it caught my attention, the Wagner Group. This Russian private security force that now appears to look at the insecurity in some of these countries, offer their services, because of course the head of state is disenfranchised, so nobody is really trying to help him. And from what they do, they come in with very dubious tactics. The British Foreign Office described them as a driver of conflict, and so they Libya and the Central African Republic. I think Mali is actually talking to them right now. What are your thoughts about that, Dr. Eze?
That is the tragedy of the vacuum that is created under this mess. So West Africa has become a contested space for foreign powers, whether it is France, whether it is UK, whether it is America, whether it is Turkey, whether it is the Gulf states. Everybody is contesting the space once again. So it's like the whole idea about the scramble and partition for Africa is back again through all forms of all manner of reasons. So it is not far from the same. So look at when Burkina had its coup d'etat. Who did they speak to? They spoke to Russia. So it's like, if you say you're not my friend, I have other friends.
Exactly.
So, and these are all interest-based. But I can assure you that this is a disaster in waiting. By the time they finish messing the architecture, all those social fabrics that hold us together, by the time we finish messing it up, we'll be porous. We'll be so porous than ever before.
It's a terrible situation. See, the unfortunate thing is that we are not together. And as long as some powers keep us apart, they will always exploit, because we have things they need. And they will come under the guise of giving protection to exploit those things. By the time you realize you are still in a mess, they are happily feeding and looking on you. And this is what some of the powers do. And so, you see, it is in our interest to get our acts together and remain united, present a united front, fund, if it is possible, some of our own activities. Too much dependence and all that, a lot of money is going down the drain because of corrupt activities. That alone, if we were to get our act together, we'll do our own things, we'll present a formidable front. But we continue to create these grounds. And so, because the military does not have the capacity to contain that whole terrorism out there and all that, and the security and all, they're calling for mercenaries to come in. And they come in with different kinds of motives. You know, so this is the unfortunate situation, and we must begin to make sure that if we put act, there's, for instance, the ECHO, which the West African, countries want to adopt as their money. Would it be in the interest of some powers that be?
No.
So if they can do this and it will not hold, why not?
Yeah.
So the geopolitics plays a key role. So terrorism, mercenarism, and all that must not be entertained.
Okay, so we're winding down. Everyone has the integrity of the country that they want to protect, which is understandable. So the question is that how can we, as a bloc, consolidate some efforts so that, I'm going back to the security issue, so that we are sharing security information in a way that, you talked about when the coup happens, then the delegation is sent. To what extent do we have intelligence of things to come in certain countries where we actually also do the preventive part of actually trying to talk to the leaders and see how we can mitigate that? I don't know, Dr. Isaac.
No, we've never had lack of that. Within the ECOWAS early warning system, which graciously ECOWAS accepted the involvement of civil society actors, we don't lack information about things that are going to happen. What we lack is the will to respond to those issues early enough. Yeah. And they are shrouded in all forms of politics and interest and all of that. And so long as that political will does not exist, early warning becomes meaningless. But we have never been in lack of any information, whether it is Guinea, whether it is Burkina Faso, whether it is Mali. We've never been lacking information about those issues.
We're running out of time, so maybe I'll start with you. What are your closing thoughts, solutions, remarks? What do you have to say?
I think we should give space for democracy to thrive. And if democracy must thrive, we must go by the principles. If leadership is not getting its act right, it creates the condition for these coups to happen. And so that is very important. I think think secondly, that civilians must also develop the habit of saying no when there are some writings on the wall which indicates that they are going to be exploited. They must do it within the democratic, exactly. And that goes a long way. And I think finally, talking about the geopolitics and all that, there are foreign interests who would always be happy to see our region, our continent apart, because that's how they profit. And if we are not smart enough, leave out the selfish interest of making ourselves rich only, but not the people, and we continue to buy and partner with them to exploit, there's always going to be trouble.
Dr. Eze, your final thoughts?
For me,
Chukwu Emeka Eze, Executive Director of the West African Network for Peace Building, WANEP. I'm Dr. Nimright, and this has been Talking Points. Thank you so much for watching and listening. As always, good night, good luck, and please be and stay safe. Till next week.